We've got one last topic before we put it all together and write our first full program, and that topic is loops. And loops are a way that we can write, or excuse me, can repeat a block of code over and over again for different input values. So we're going to start with the list. You see I got a names list with 7 names in it, and I want to print out a statement using each of those names. But I don't want to have to print 7 different print statements when the only thing that's changing is the name. So the way that we handle that is using a loop. And so there are a couple different kinds of loops. We're going to start with what's called a for loop. And so a for loop repeats a block of code for each item in a list. So the way that we write that is for name, and so we create a variable name here. This could be anything, but we want it to make sense. And so the way we kind of read this is for each name in the names list, colon. Okay, so let me pause here for a second and look at this in depth. You can read that, but the way that we want to read it mentally is for each name in the list of names, right? So this variable name here could have been anything. I could have called it n. I could have called it blah. I could have called, well, I probably want to spell blah right. I could have called it blah. Could have called it whatever I want, but I should name it in a way that helps us read what's going on clearly. So for each name in the names list. So what's going to happen here is that whatever I write indented in this block is going to happen once for each of the names in this list. Okay, so what am I going to do? In this case, I'm just going to print something to the screen. Okay, I'm going to print the statement, nobody knows Python like name. Okay, and what is that going to do? It's going to print the string nobody knows Python like, and then a space with whatever value name currently has. And since name is going to take on each of these names in succession, it's going to print this 7 times, changing the name each time. So if I hit enter a couple times, there we go. Nobody knows Python like Kevin, nobody knows Python like Dina, etc. down the list. So we can see what that for loop is doing. It's causing a repetition of the indented code, changing only this name variable as we loop through this list. Okay? And that's the purpose of a for loop in Python, is to loop through a list. For loops in other languages are slightly different, but Python for loops loop through lists, items in lists. So we can use that to do a variety of different things. Let's write a function that can find the smallest value in a list. Okay, now there's already a function that does this. It's the min function. You're aware of that, but let's write this function anyway, just to show that we know how to do that and that we can use a for loop in a meaningful way. So I'm going to write a function called def find minimum value. And this will take as an input a list of values, which I will call values. Okay. Now what I want to do is loop through this list of values and return the one that is the smallest. Okay. Now I don't know ahead of time which one's the smallest. This isn't an ordered list. They might be in any kind of order, so the smallest one might be in the middle or at the end or at the beginning. Who knows? But we're going to loop through the list and return the smallest one. So what I'm going to do first is create a variable. Call it minimum. Okay, and this is something we haven't done in a function in the other tutorial videos, but I can create a variable inside this function, and then that variable will belong to this function, and I can use it while I'm indented into this function. So I'm going to make the minimum value the first one. How do I get the first one again? I say value sub 0. Okay, remember 0 is the starting index in a list. It's the first value. Why am I doing that? Well, I don't know what the minimum is, but I'm going to make, if you will, that's what the equals. I'm going to assign the first value in the list to minimum as an assumption, and then we'll check the other ones and see if they're less. So at this point, I want to loop through each item in the values. So I'm going to say for num, maybe I shouldn't even say num. This could be a list of any kind of value, but for value in values, what am I saying? For each value in the list of values. Well, now I need to check if the current value is less than the minimum. So if the value that I'm looking at is less than what I currently believe to be the minimum, then I want to make the minimum that value, right? So all I'm saying here is that I'm looping through each of the values in the list, and if the value that I'm looking at is less than what I previously believed to be the minimum, then reassign minimum to be that new value. And then we'll continue looping through the list. You can see we're kind of combining some things here, right? We've got a for loop. Inside that for loop, we have a conditional. And you can see inside that conditional, we have a command. And the indenting continues, throughout. So every time we move in after a colon, right, we indent. And so that indenting is important. If the value I'm looking at is not less than the minimum, then the minimum is still what I think it is, and we'll just leave it alone. We won't do anything. It's not necessary to have an elif or an else for every if. At this point, if this isn't true, I don't want to do anything, so I'm not going to. And then what this will do at the end of the loop, or by the end of the loop, minimum will be the smallest value in the list. Hopefully that makes sense to you, because we'll have looped through all of the items, checking to see if the minimum one is, if the value that I'm looking at is less than the one that I believe to be the minimum, and updating that each time. So by the end of the loop, minimum should be the smallest value in the list. I'm now done with the loop, and I want to return as my answer, as my output of this function, that minimum value. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and run this module in order to define that minimum value function. Just call this temp. Okay, so I've defined that function, and now maybe I want like a values list, and I'll say, values is 9, 5, 7, 8, 2, 6. Okay, the minimum value is 2, but I can use my function to say find minimum value and pass in the values, and there it is, 2. Okay, it looped through and set the minimum first to 9, then 5 was less than 9, so it made the minimum 5, then to 7, but no, 5 minimum was less than 7, so it stayed 5, became 2, stayed 2, returned 2. And so that's how our function worked. Keep in mind, I said that this find minimum values, find minimum value, it works on numbers, but it also works on other things, right? I've got this names list, I could do that as well. And it will give me a value there too. So find minimum value names list. Whoops, what did I do wrong? Restarted the show. Let's try that again. Find minimum value names list. Abby, right? Well, what does that mean? It just means that Abby comes first in the alphabet as we compare to the other names. And so minimum value when we're talking about strings is what's called lexicographic order. So it's the order of how the letters come in the computer language. So you can see that these functions are, kind of versatile. They can do a lot of different things. Okay, so there you go. Let's look at a second type of loop. Actually, it's still a for loop, but we're going to use it a little bit differently. Sometimes we might not want to loop through a list. We might just want to run the loop a certain number of times, right? So in our first couple of examples here, we wanted to loop through a certain list, but maybe I just want to run something 10 times, let's say, or 5 times or 8 times. In those cases, we still use a for loop, but we also use what's called the range function. So we say for some counter variable, often I is used, but it could be anything. For I in range 10. Now what that means is run this loop, run the following indented code this many times, 10 times, okay? And actually, I will take on each of the values in that range. Now, the range works kind of like indices do in that it starts at 0 and ends at 1 less than this number, so it doesn't include 10. It goes up to 10, but not inclusive. So it will run 10 times, but the values I takes on will be 0 through 9. And so there you go. This ran 10 times. So whenever you know you want to run something a certain amount of times, a certain number of times, you want to use this range function in order to make that happen. And then the value of the variable will be, like I said, 0 through 1 minus that value, or that value minus 1, excuse me. There's one other kind of loop that's important to know about that's different than a for loop. It's called a while loop, and it runs while a certain condition is true. And so let's say, for instance, we've got a date, okay, and the date, it's like a date of the month, and it's 13, okay? And while the date is less than, let's say, 22, we're going to print today is December, comma there, date, okay, not yet winter break, okay, and then we will, whoops, missed a comma. Put the comma in the wrong place. And each time we will add 1 to date. So we're going to use the plus equals operator. Okay, remember that means date gets date plus 1. Date becomes itself plus 1. Okay. And so this loop will run until date is no longer less than 22. In other words, until date becomes 22, right? When date becomes 22, this condition is no longer true. So while loops are a lot like if statements, except that they cause a repetition. An if statement just runs once, a while statement runs until the condition is false, repeatedly. And so you can see the result of that, right? And then on December 22nd, presumably winter break has begun, okay? But this is the other kind of loop, that while loop. You want to have a condition that you want to make sure can change within the loop, right? If I didn't have the date plus equals 1 here, date would always be less than 22 and we would run forever. That's called an infinite loop. That's bad because that would just keep going forever and you get stuck in your program. Okay, that's it. In the next video, we will write a full program that has input and output and loops and conditionals and lists and all kinds of good stuff, and you'll be ready to work on any Python project that we do.